Hello, theology nerds. I am excited about this special episode today. You're going to nerd out with your geek out, but it is going to be cinematonic, but also Christological, because this is the first of a series of podcasts in which I'll be joined by the one and only Barry Taylor and Ryan Parker, who are both like professional, like PhDs in like culture, religion-y, theology, movie type things. They know things. And we're going to be going through a series of Jesus movies. And on this first episode, where we're going to talk about Jesus movies, we're going to talk about The Last Temptation of Christ, Scorsese's film. It's going to be super zesty. And like, this one's going to be longer than all the others because the first 20, 25 minutes or so is just us talking about Jesus films and what it means to interpret film, a Jesus film, and culture, hermeneutics, and other things like that. And then it goes into the movie. And in the future episodes in the series, we'll be just jumping straight in the movie. Like, up next is going to be Jesus of Montreal. Oh, yes. And we're going to do Life of Brian. And The Passion of the Christ. Gospel of St. Matthew. Anyway, we're going to do Jesus movies. And if you enjoy the trinity of theological reflection on movies, then you should tell us. Make suggestions of what else we should talk about. We got a list of Jesus movies, including Last Days in the Desert, that we're going to do, and I'm excited about that because, I don't know, Ewan McGregor's hair was really, really, really nice when I interviewed him. No, it's because I really enjoyed the movie. So you should make sure you check out Last Days in the Desert and look forward to more theological engagement, nerding out, you could say, about Jesus movies. Before we jump in to the conversation, I want to let you know a few things. If you're going to go to Wild Goose this summer, and why not? I don't know. But if you're thinking about it, you should do it. And when you go to get your ticket, use the code GOOSECAST 2016. It's like podcast 2016, except instead of pod, it's a goose. Not geese cast. Goose. 2 O's. Cast 2016. Get 25% off. I'll be there. And doing a whole bunch of stuff. Getting to do Theological Happy Hour with Emily Townsend, Jorg Rieger. That's going to be amazing. I'm going to teach, so you want to start a podcast class? And then I'm going to teach, take yours to the next level class. I'm going to do a live podcast. Culturecast peeps are going to be there, including Slim Moon. Mickey Jones is going to be there. Daniel Kirk, LectioCast style is going to be there. And the Indigo Girls, because that happens. Even other podcasters are going to be there, like Science Mike, the liturgist, and things. So there's a whole podcast tent. How could you not want to go on podcast tent time? All right? There we go. You could say, I know, because the next week I'm going to be in Vancouver at Vancouver School of Theology when you're doing a Theology Nerd Boot Camp with John Cobb and Jay McDaniel. And then I'm staying over if I don't live in Vancouver because I'm going to go to the live podcast with you and Sally McFay. Because I already know that Sally McFay is one of the most amazing, greatest all-time feminist theologians, developed metaphorical theology, a book called Models of God, and is processy, eco, awesome. Yeah. But anyway, you could be doing that too. Nonetheless, make sure you stop by homebrewedchristianity.com in the near future and make sure you're signed up for the email list, so that you get sent a little email each week telling you all the different episodes that have come out, when upcoming live events or free live streaming webinar type things are going on, or online classes are coming up, or what we're doing in our Epic Read series with Philip Clayton, what books we're reading and stuff. You can join us online for. But also, and here's the kicker, not only will you stay informed without losing any sweat. Did I miss a tweet? No, you don't have to worry about that. You get the email. But the most important part is I'm going to start sending email list only special video content. I've recorded a number of them already. We did a webinar with Monica Coleman. 500 people signed up. But if you didn't one of the people that signed up and were there live, you're like, how can I watch it? Be on the email list. We're going to send a little treat. Or I recorded a thing with church historian Bill Leonard on lessons from church history to help us understand the contemporary collision a religion and politics that is our presidential election. That was a huge episode. Actually, it was like 30 amazing minute video discussion. I mean, you can listen to the audio as well, but that's what I'm trying. Anyway, nonetheless, sign up for that. You'll know what's going on. All right? And then when you get done listening to this, tell me. When you get done listening to this, tell me what you think about movies and Jesus movies. What other ones we should make sure we cover. What we should do after we talk about the set of initial Jesus movies we're into. Be like, do you like it? What's up? Inputs. It was a suggestion of podcast listeners. Now I just want to know. Is this what you were asking for? Always here to listen to, please, to titillate your theological imagination so you can brew your own faith. So here it is. Last Temptation of Christ. James Ryan Parker. Barry Taylor. Boom. Hello, podcast peoples. This is Tripp, and I'm here with Barry Taylor.
Hello, Tripp.
And we have our friend Ryan Parker here.
Hey.
And we're gonna talk about movies with Jesus in it.
Yeah, we are.
And it's going to be amazing. So I just hope you're prepared. And but first, Barry, we should let Ryan introduce himself.
Yeah,
because
so.
We've had Morgan Freeman on the podcast, and then we're like, who's going to follow up Morgan Freeman? I had requests.
Barry.
Yeah. I thought it was going to be Ray Parker Jr., but instead it's Ryan Parker. But
but see, or it could have been Cutter.
Yeah, it's true. But he got cutted.
Cutter backed out, so I'm Cutter's replacement.
No, we
invented a new term, getting cutted, because he got edited out of his show.
Yeah.
To the point of pointlessness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we just called it getting cuttered.
I like it.
Oh, no. So we actually, we had Princess Alice was on the podcast.
That's right, Princess Alice made it.
She's imaginary, though.
Yeah.
Okay.
But she makes you act moral. And now then Morgan Freeman, Ryan Parker.
Yeah.
And hi, Ryan.
Hi.
You want to introduce yourself?
Ryan Parker. I did a PhD in film and religion, and I work in film marketing, I guess.
There you go.
That's what you do with a PhD.
We went to divinity school.
Try to sell movies. Yeah, we did.
Or at least the same divinity school.
Hey, let's just discuss the fact that Ryan and I won the Theology After Google Cornhole Championship.
Destroyed people.
So let's just remember.
When are we going to have another one of those conferences?
Well,
that's a good
first time ever playing, and we managed to pull it off, Ryan.
Yeah.
So
I remember in the final round.
Yeah, I remember.
Wasn't there a trophy?
Oh, yeah. Barry has it.
I still got it.
Was it a toilet or something?
No, it was like, it's actually a fairly good trophy because Tripp thought he was going to get it for himself.
Yeah. He shoved out the money for the nice
some money in it. Yeah. He thought it was going to be for him, but we triumphed, Ryan.
Yeah.
I was thinking of welding it to the hood of my Fiat.
And you beat.
Oh, that would be great.
You beat Doug Padgett in the last round, who was taking it very seriously.
He's so tall, he could have leaned over and put it in, but
it's like that old Bonzo or whatever.
My favorite part about that was getting an email from the guy at the LA Times asking for an explanation of what the cornhole tournament is. And I was like, what is that? And I explained it, and he was I correct that I heard you yelling, you just got shucked, son? And I was like, yeah, it was.
Yeah, I think that came from Heidegger.
Yes.
How was that conference received? Like, looking back on it, was it
kind of got shucked?
Yeah.
I think it went really well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've had lots of people bring it up, and
I had fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to teach a class next year called Theology After Google.
Yeah.
So,
woo!
It's catchy.
It's catchy.
You know what else is catchy?
Who's teaching
Jesus.
That?
Barry and I are going to teach it. And we're going to...
Are you teaching down here now?
Yes, every once in a while.
Okay.
I do a lot of things in order to get to hang out with Barry.
And I respond to a lot of things to get to hang out with Tripp.
So, I know. What I really like are efficient podcast introductions. Those are my specialty, you could say.
Instead of sort of lengthy, meandering ones.
Yeah. My favorite thing is that the intro for the N.T. Wright thing when I got on to record it with Luke.
Yeah.
I recorded a 35-minute intro.
Yeah. That was actually not quite as long as that question that you asked Rob Bell at the other podcast at the Monkey's Brewery. That was like a 37-minute question.
That night got a little out of hand.
What do you mean?
I don't know.
After all the parts he didn't want on the internet were gone, it seemed pretty.
2-minute interview.
Oh, you know what? That'll be the only time we're talking in public. and his note to every friend that ever does it is like, look, if he doesn't bring alcohol up with him to the stage, don't say, get your beer.
Right. Exactly.
Or else people just keep bringing refills.
Exactly.
What
can you do?
You graciously
accept. Yeah.
All things to all people.
Practice of hospitality, really.
Yes.
Deeply theological.
Exactly.
Yeah. And welcoming even.
Mm-hmm.
Inclusive.
All
encompassing. Unboundaried. Yeah. So we're going to talk about film then?
Beer.
All right. So we're going to talk about movies that Jesus are in.
Yeah.
And this
Jesus starred in.
Yeah. These are...
It's the lesser-known film career of Jesus.
Came back time and time again.
Yeah. Oh, man, that... And there's been a lot of different Jesus films, and I've watched some of them. But now I'm watching more of them because I'm going to talk to you with both of you.
Yeah.
But first off, why take films seriously? Because a lot of people that
you're assuming that we are.
Oh my God. Okay,
play along, Ryan.
Yeah. You remember that time you did a degree in it? Pretend.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. Think of the money that you spent on that degree, and then think about taking it seriously, Ryan.
But no, we're having a conversation. Here's the goal, everyone, is that we talk about the movies. Then we'll make a little discussion guide thingy. That would be a PDF you can download and print out. Then you can watch the movies and use them to facilitate discussion guides, or, I don't know, fold them for paper airplanes, or
you could just leave the movie on mute and play the podcast over it.
Ooh.
And we're thinking about doing something like that, right?
Theater,
yeah.
For an upcoming episode?
Yeah, episode 1000. That's what I want to do.
In LA?
I think so. I think it needs to happen.
Over at the Actors Theater?
Yes. I support it.
So why take movies seriously?
Yeah. So
all right, I'm gonna throw a idea out there.
You throw something.
Throw it.
I think especially with Jesus movies, I like talking about Jesus movies. All movies do this in one way or the other, but with Jesus films, you have the added layer of theology, spirituality, and all that. For me, they're kind of like markers, like kind of cultural, historical markers of what people were thinking about culturally, religiously, theologically when they emerged. So you look at something like any film from like the 20s or 30s that's a religious film. There's a certain sensibility to it,
sure,
that is just absolutely thrown out the window in 85, right? With The Last Temptation. So I always like to, what can we go back and kind of glean from that? I think that's just one thing for me. And I mean, it's an art form. I mean, it's something that people work really, really hard to make, even if the movies are shitty. You know, the people that work really hard to put these things together.
And it's a meaning-making medium. I mean, it's communicating meaning on some form or another, or at least it's giving clues about the human condition. It's making statements about what people perceive to be the state of humanity, the challenges of being human, the joys of being human.
So when you take Jesus, like if you've taught classes with people that are in seminary and stuff, I feel there are some ways how not to take a film about Jesus in order to hear it well.
Well, yes. I mean, I think first off, you have to realize, usually people rush to judgment before they've even thought about it, which, you know, is one of the reasons we're starting with the last Temptation, really, because that was probably one of the films about Jesus that created complete and total uproar before anybody had even seen it. Because I think that was sort of in the days before there weren't really mass screenings and things like that. Very few people ever got to see a film back then outside of the studio, but there was such a fuss about this film coming out, and people already with defensive positions. And I think the challenge with watching films, and particularly religious films, is that you have to be willing to let the film speak to you. You have to be open to what it has to say. You don't have to like it or dislike it, but you can't sort of, I don't think it's a smart thing to determine before you go in that you're not going to like something, or that it's going to be wrong, or that you're going to have to correct it. It's a piece of art, so it needs to say what it needs to say, and then you can begin a kind of conversation and a dialogue around that.
One of the analogies I've used is that, like, when you're dealing with a Jesus film, you kind of have to spend long enough with it to let it tell you what it's really about. Kind of like you have 4 different Gospels in the New Testament, and each one has its own flavor. And you understand Matthew better if you let Matthew tell you about Matthew, as opposed to inserting Paul's thoughts into it. Or, and you know about Ryan and Barry's experience of faith by letting you tell it in your own way and stuff, rather than listening long enough to fix your theology and make you agree with me.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, that's obviously a little bit challenging when it comes to, like a Jesus film, because I think, after a while, when you sort of read the Bible, you tend to bring everything that's in your mind to what you're reading and layer it over. But I think my rule of thumb is, it's a bit like an album. It might hit you a certain way the first time, and you have a visceral response, which can be good or bad. But if you really want to dig into it, you have to be willing to look at it more than once, or look at it in a way in which the depth of the story can come at you. Because sometimes you see a film and you really like it, and you don't really remember that much about it. It might be one scene, it might be a chase scene or something like that. But you go back and you watch it, and the nuances start to emerge. So I think my rule of thumb is always spend some time with a film, and particularly films that have perhaps some kind of theological significance. I mean, I think lots of films you can dialogue with theologically, but if we're going to say that cultural movies about Jesus have a particular theological interest, or might have a particular theological interest, it's pretty good to sit with those things and really dig in, get a little bit of backstory, to know where people are coming from, what perhaps intentions were, or at least desires, maybe.
I think another, to kind of echo a point that you made, which is,
and I don't have a PhD in film like matey over here, so
yeah. So I think one of the things that I like, or that I don't like, that's difficult to do, and I think it might be unique to religious films or Jesus films, is we bring to bear, we know what Jesus looks like, right?
Sure.
We know the Gospels.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to sit and watch this movie, and I bring all this to bear, and it's really hard to be humble. I think you have to practice a bit of humility to say, I'm going to try to let that go in ways that other movies don't demand of you. Like if you just go see the new Civil War movie, well, maybe a bad example because there's a whole mythology for these superheroes, but your average film, you're not having to fight that kind of inner struggle. And I don't like doing that, right? Because I'm right, and I know the way this thing plays out.
Yeah, I mean, don't you think that religious films in general are quite difficult? Because don't you remember there was a little spate, I don't know whether it was the turn of millennium or the 90s, but there was the Keanu Reeves Buddha movie and the Kundun movie, and it doesn't matter, or it almost doesn't matter what the religion is. It treads in very difficult waters because of all of those symbolic images that we carry and the concerns that we have, or some people have, about sanctity or, sacrality, preserving all of those kind of things. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge for a group of people to sit down and look at a Jesus film and look at it with openness.
Even good Jesus movies,
which are, I think, hard to come by.
Yes.
Especially when they really try. I think that for me, the line where I find it most difficult is when they attempt to tell. Like I think we're going to talk about Pasolini's Gospel of Matthew, right? Which I think is one of the few sort of biblical Jesus films that actually works. And I think it works for a number of reasons that we can maybe talk about when we get to that. But generally, if they're too embedded in portraying events in the gospel, it gets, I don't know, something goes a little bit.
I don't know why I'm getting kind of hung up on this thought about few other art forms have that tension though.
Yeah.
It's not hard to look at religious art, for example, paintings of any style.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with that. Like it's not that difficult, like going to watch even a good Jesus movie. I still have this internal struggle, but I go see any other.
Is it the,
I'm like, well, that's great.
Sensory, like movies take over. Like if you're watching a movie.
They sort of impact reality. In a way, you know, I mean, they're the create, you know, a painting, is a representation. Cinema is representation, but it also creates an alternative world that you go into for a couple of hours. And if it works really well, you know, you get enveloped in that world and, we can get precious about that, I think.
Well, if it doesn't work, it's like a prison.
That's my experience with a lot of films.
One of the reasons I find Jesus films as a challenge, but also an asset, especially if you're using it to think and reflect or discuss it, is that it's really hard to, in a medium like film, just to retell the gospel story, because you're making choices that include large numbers of interpretive moments that if you just read the Gospel of John, the church has 1 million interpretations of John. But if you make a film, literally, and the only thing you say is stuff that's in the Gospel of John, you now have a theology that with all the decisions and so there's a sense that a film about Jesus is the creator's reauthoring of the story of Jesus and not just a retelling. Yeah. And the power of reauthoring the one a lot of people either have a love-hate relationship with the story of Jesus is offensive. So when you think of even the Gospel of Matthew, there are parts in it that if you are an American who loves freedom, liberty, nation states, and capitalism, you're going to be uncomfortable with him imposing socialist hippy-dippy stuff on Jesus.
You know, when an atheist Marxist Italian homosexual makes a movie about Jesus.
And it's one of the best Jesus movies ever made.
There,
and surprisingly closer to the biblical text than the others.
Well, because it's the Gospel of Matthew, I mean, but yeah, it's gonna be, it will be problematic. And I think it has to be seen as interpretive.
Yeah, it's also helpful, like, to know that that's what human beings do all the time with the Jesus story. It's always interpretation, and the
well, except for the people that have the truth.
Well, they are not listening to this. But the other part is that every person that you sit in a room and discuss a Jesus film with, has their own telling of it as well. Sure. So I'm a professional theologian. I regularly discovered that people at my church did not know the correct answers to things. And yet they were still there and had thoughts and feelings and experiences of God as mediated by Jesus. And there's a certain beauty that through a film, everyone is now stuck with this reauthoring through the film to discuss and things. It could be an opening or a fissure or a space that allows the same group of people to be more honest about their own telling of the Jesus story rather than just, repeating the expected one that you're supposed to have to fit in that group.
I like, maybe this is going back a bit to why films matter, but it's also important for the religious component too, is that film watching is a communal experience in ways that, few other medium are. So when I saw this, somebody posted on Twitter, a film critic, expressing dismay over the fact that there was this bad movie, and I wish I could remember what it was. It's been within the last month or two, which had been panned critically, was doing well at the box office. And this person wrote, do people not listen to us? Like, they were genuinely dismayed that their opinion had not swayed or had any impact on the box office. And I was thinking, you are so full of crap, you know?
Oh, yes.
That's really good.
And it's like going to church with people who have different, they're going to go, they have different opinions than you.
Uh-huh. Oh, and the worst, like after you go to divinity school and then you go listen to a preacher that had made significant impacts on your life, and you hear them preach and you're like, oh my God, what horrible exegesis. It's like they just didn't even pay attention in Hebrew Bible class. And you have this like completely different relationship, and then you go tell your parents after, our minister's an idiot, right?
And they're like, no, that sermon was one of the best ones he's ever preached.
And you're like, but I'm concerned. Like, I really think he thinks like Moses really wrote the books. And I was distracted at that point. No JEDP in this thing. And that's like a movie critic. They didn't listen.
Yeah.
You're like, why are people listening to Jerry curls?
Yeah. Why are...
So, anyway,
oh, there's a lull.
Last temptation of Christ. If people haven't seen it in a while, but like, what are the things we need to be thinking of if we want to know, what's going on, what's being brought to it, who are the people involved?
I mean, I think the first thing you should know is that it's based on a book by Nikos Kazantzakis. Is that how you say the last name?
If you say it confidently, we'll all agree with you.
Yeah.
Didn't you do Greek at school?
No.
Koine.
And then, of course, it's directed by Martin Scorsese. And I think what people need to know is, to Barry's point about the protest, people protesting movies before they even see it, as was done with this film. It's seemingly controversial, because it's so different than other Jesus movies that had come before it. But it's a story from these two men, the author of the book and then Scorsese, who have deep spiritual questions, right? Mm-hmm. And who are fairly committed individuals of faith, right? Scorsese being Catholic and having debated whether or not to go to seminary at one point. Mm-hmm. And that this text in its original form is this trying to wrestle with what it means to be fully human and fully divine.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there are a couple of other external things, because when the film came out in the late 1980s, it was a very different time than now. And some people say that this film was really the sort of central tipping point of the whole sort of culture war thing. And it was definitely, in a period of time where it was a little, I think actually a little more surprising that somebody was making, a religious film. I mean, there's a lot of religious films around now, a lot of theological films. There weren't that many, in the late 1980s. And it was very polarizing. I mean, people, as we said, were protesting it before it came out, and they were really incensed by, the notion, I think of the sexual component I seem to remember that a lot of the fuss was around, the concern about, elements of the film that sort of highlight Jesus and having sex or stuff like that. And again, it was inflamed. There was a lot of rhetoric and polemic before it even came out. But that, is really, again, I think another reason why it's sort of worth a look, because I think when you go back and look at it now, I'm not so sure it stands the test of time, personally. I mean, I don't know, and I didn't watch the whole thing again. I've seen it a few times since then, but I'm not so sure it really holds up in such a profound way as it did in that particular time when there was a volatility in the air. You know, I mean, that's the sort of era of the rise of the, you know, moral majority and all those kind of things. So there was some real sort of cultural wrestlings going on that the film kind of became a lightning rod for, and in many ways, I mean, I remember conversations where your position about that film kind of determined friend or enemy status. You know what I mean? Oh, so I know where you fit in this whole scheme. You know, I mean, we do that.
See, I have only had that about like Hot Tub Time Machine.
Yeah, 2 or 1.
Well, the sequel is better than the first, just like
Neighbors 2 is going to be better than Neighbors 1.
I was thinking Godfather, but
Sisterhood against
Sisterhood. Yeah. So that's,
you know, but there's an interesting quote. You know, at the time, Martin Scorsese, he said this. He said, "I've always wanted to do films of the spirit, spiritual films, but religion gets in the way." That's a comment that he made in 1988 about the film. So on one level,
and some people still differentiate being spiritual and religious.
Well,
so.
But again, it's worth remembering that at that period in time, the notion of spirituality separate from religion wasn't as defined as it is today. Yeah. So religiosity was a much more sort of dominant thread. I mean, it's in the 30 years or you know, thereabouts since then that culturally we've undergone these shifts with regard to our relationship towards religion and spirituality and stuff. So this comes out. It's an attempt at spirituality.
Yeah.
In the face of a much more cohesive religious thing. So in that way, the film attempts something that in some ways is perhaps easier today than it may have been then. I don't know. Maybe it's never easy to do that, but he was trying to get at the essence of something, I think, rather than, and you know, there's a disclaimer that, the film sort of technically it's a fictional exploration of kind of a conflict between, you know, spirit and flesh. And they make the statement that, you know, it's not based on the Gospels.
Yeah.
Which I think is a way of kind of, you know, distancing. I think Scorsese wanted to distance himself from the writers of the Gospel. You know what I mean? And I think that's where it gets interesting, with a film about Jesus when it doesn't get so tied to maybe the missional aims of, but of course, religious people sense and feel an ownership of their leader, if you like. So
yeah, I mean,
when someone,
how you get gospels in the Bible and those that get out.
Exactly. But you know, so on one level, there's something to be sort of said, I think, from grappling with the periphery of a religious character. I mean, I think that's kind of what makes the Last Days in the Desert movie kind of interesting, you know, the one that's just come out with Ewan McGregor, because it's not attempting to tell a gospel story. It's using those things as a catalyst to tell another story. So The Last Temptation is an exploration of a very complex subject, you know, because it's dealing with the duality of Jesus, human, divine. And you know, we can, and you can like or dislike the conclusions or the direction or the aims or the intentions of the story. But if you reel it back in and you delve into the world of theology, what you realize, of course, is that this is a 2 millennia contested terrain in spite of councils, creedal statements and all that kind of stuff. Arguments have gone on for millennia over what this means, you know, what it means that Jesus was tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. What's that line? You know, is thinking about it. Is that sin? You know, well, if it's not, you know, where's the temptation? You know, so it raises questions. What does it mean to be tempted? You know,
because it feels like this is great. It feels like this is a great film to start with because no other Jesus movie had really done that, right? I mean,
Right.
Before then it was all, let's just try to put on this equivalent of a church play.
Yeah.
Where we're trying to hit all the notes that people
Which you could
are familiar
do
with.
because culturally society was more attuned to that kind of, that's what they expected. King of Kings, the Ten Commandments,
Yeah.
you know, the telling of stories in ways that everybody could just revel in the spectacle that they knew and understood. But, you know, by the time you get into the late 80s, we're in a kind of moving towards a kind of post Christendom dynamic within culture and society. And you start to see the emergence of things like doubt and questioning and yet embrace.
Yeah.
And the culture war is an example
and the
of
culture was an example of that, you know. So all these things that we talk about today, you know, doubt and all that kind of stuff. It's not that they weren't around, but they weren't on the surface of the culture in the way that they are now. So to take a figure like this and to take a book like that, which of course comes from the Orthodox Church anyway. So you already have a difference in perspective on the whole nature of Jesus anyway. If you do your Eastern Orthodox theology, right, Tripp?
Oh, well, for a good 30-minute excursus, we can unpack. But
you go, baby.
Your podcast.
So the other question I had, and I remember talking about this before at some point, Ryan, where about the relationship of Hollywood culture and the church and how the culture war and these religious films have been a part of that story. Like, how would you describe the transition time when it comes to Hollywood's relationship to church and culture?
It's a huge question. I mean, I think it's interesting to look at the history of film. I argue that you could tell the history of film by just looking at religious movies. That religious movies have always been at the forefront of certainly of the creation of film. I mean, one of the first movies is the Passion Play. And then you look at the introduction of sound, then the introduction of color, and then big special effects and this kind of evolution. And there are religious films that are kind of prime examples of those moments. And they're probably equally influential in these conversations that we're talking about with the culture wars. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you agree, Barry, but it doesn't feel to me, having been here in LA for 3 years and sat in on meetings and at different studios and production companies, nobody's sitting there saying, let's wage war on the church or on traditional family values. This is not an intentional thing. Like, I think a lot of people paint it to be.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
If anything, it's just how can we make money off of this? And the church is not innocent of that line of thought either.
No, you're saying that the church may occasionally do things to make money that don't cohere with its mission? Because
maybe. But one more thing is, I think you can see, and it's far more reactionary than it is prophetic or out in front of anything.
Yeah, I mean, I've had this conversation lots of times with people. I think by virtue of the process of filmmaking, it's impossible for it to be prophetic, but in the rarest of senses and occasions, because the length of time it takes to get a film made, even in this day and age, just precludes it speaking very much about the future. I think that's why I agree with you. I think film is a reflection of the times, the conditions, and the circumstance in which we live and breathe. We live and move and have our being, as it were.
Well, Paul said that, but he doesn't show up in Last Temptation till the end.
I know. Well, sorry, I was just.
I know.
Preempting.
You're just trying to show. But
I think that's why films can be helpful in sort of charting the sort of cultural developments, and this film does point to a significant moment within the culture where the ground is changing. You know, there's growing. You know, from the 60s forward, there's kind of growing disillusionment with organized and institutional religion and a rising tide of alternative spiritualities. But Jesus remains a topic of conversation because he's one of the key cultural figures. Cultural figures, but I mean, it's the cultural theorist Mika Baal. Mm-hmm. She sort of says that when you're thinking about culture, you have to acknowledge that one of the pillars of Western civilization is Christianity. And even if we only live with the vapor trail of it today, it's still there. It still shapes our symbolic world. It's why when you go to see a film, it's so easy to identify what we would say are sort of theological ideas like redemption and forgiveness and salvation and stuff like that, because that vapor trail of ideas it permeates and shapes Western civilization. It's not a question of whether you believe or don't believe. It's just those images and those symbols are there. So the appropriation, the occasional appropriation of Jesus as a sort of trope for the exploration of ideas about the relationship between humanity and the divine, it makes sense to me.
And then to add to that, when you talk about this kind of vapor trail, I like that kind of image, because you talk about engaging films theologically that aren't made by people of faith. No. Right? They're these kind of echoes of these themes of redemption or whatever, even in these films. So to create this kind of stark division. Yeah. And then to think about the films that the people who like to participate and kind of stoke those fires, right? So we'll talk about another film, the Passion of the Christ is 2004. Well, by 2006, there are a wave of religious movies that are trying to sort of capitalize. I mean, Hollywood's thinking solely about money. Like, how can we get passion dollars? But other people who are kind of marketing these things are saying, some people are saying, yeah, but these are finally our movies. Yeah. Right? And go see these movies, not those. And so, and then you have people like the Kendrick brothers in Georgia who make their movies, and they say, go see these, not those. And what they fail to see, and maybe they do and they just ignore it, most people don't know, is that the fact that you can go see their movies, there's a whole system of relationships in place where Sony is distributing their movie. Yeah. Right. So they can't exist in that space without
the
Hollywood.
Christian filmmakers.
Yeah.
Where you're like, this one is a Jesus film.
Yeah. Like God's not dead.
The propagandists, really. Yeah. I mean, they might term themselves differently, but exactly. I think it's propaganda. Yeah. It's ideological. Yeah. It's ideological.
Yeah. So if you aren't a film person, who's Martin Scorsese? Because all I know is he's a famous director, and you're supposed to like his movies if you like film. But that's what I got.
Well, we should just go home, Ryan, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Scorsese is probably, you could say, is a monumental figure in the world of cinema on a number of levels. As a director, as a writer, as a film aficionado, historian, preservationist. I mean, this is a man who's devoted his life to cinema as a means of exploring his interests about what it means to be human. I mean, he's made some pretty stunning movies.
And his.
Do we want to name them?
Yeah. I mean, his passion for movies, like the film that he's working on now, I think they're in post on, is Silence, which is about missionaries to Japan. Yeah. He goes and makes The Wolf of Wall Street. Yep. So he can make movies that he actually wants to make. So he can navigate these sorts of, he has passion projects, but he's willing to do these bigger.
Yeah. And I think I'd probably say they're all passion projects, but one's certain passions are easier to fund.
But he executes The Wolf of Wall Street. It's a great film. Totally. It's not like he's selling out to do a crappy film just so he can make something really good.
Yeah. But anyway, so he's a seminal figure in
so what are like his
and has
top
been
five?
Since his top 5 films. Ooh.
I've got the IMDb list here.
Oh, well then I'm
just going to throw some out.
Go on.
So, Mean Streets. Is that what? Oh, it doesn't even go back. Hold on. Let me cue up the director. But Mean Streets for me is one of the best.
He's Italian American, so big on the gangster.
Yeah. So let's go. We'll start from the beginning. Who's That Knocking at My Door? Boxcar Bertha. I'm skipping a few.
Yeah.
Mean Streets, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Taxi Driver, New York, The Last Waltz, one of my favorite rock and roll documentaries.
He's big on rock and roll too.
Raging Bull.
Yeah.
I mean, if you stop there, it's a hell of a career.
Yeah.
Let's see.
But wait, there's more.
The Color of Money, The Last Temptation, obviously, that we're talking about. Goodfellas, Cape Fear, Casino, Kundun, mentioned this earlier. Let's see. Gangs of New York, The Aviator, The Departed, Shutter Island. Of course, one episode of Boardwalk Empire, but I think his fingerprints are over a lot of that.
Yeah. Vinyl.
The Wolf of Wall Street, Hugo, which is really a love letter to the early days of film.
Yep. The Bob Dylan documentary.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
Sinatra. Well, he's announced for a Sinatra film.
Yeah. And, he's got his new film, as Ryan said, is about missionaries in Japan. So, and, Italian-American Catholic roots, exploring the human condition. So on the basis of, that's a lot of that comes after The Last Temptation, but even what he did before The Last Temptation kind of set him up to be, and that's part of the deal as well, is that here's this big Hollywood producer or director who's making a film about our Jesus. That was one of the sort of polarizing things, because I don't think that there was a lot of awareness amongst people that he had any kind of affirmed faith position. Mm-hmm. And again, back in the late 80s, polarizing anyway between, a little bit of polarization between Protestants and Catholics around those things. And there's a lot of activity. It's also worth noting in all of this that the Catholic community has been way ahead of Protestants in terms of engaging with film and theology, purely, I think, because of the sort of Catholic sacramental view of life and the world, and their comfort with imagery. Yeah. Whereas, the Protestant church, that edited images out of the space and is more about the space itself.
Well, and even if you were to, the difference between a Protestant sermon and a Catholic sermon, when it goes to interpreting, the Protestant sermons is built to articulate the word.
Yeah.
Catholic sermons,
which is why
the Eucharist and the Eucharist.
Yeah. Which is why there's a lot of theological concern over the arts within Protestantism, because abstract, paradox, complexity,
those are gateways.
Tensions. Well, they're problems. We think they're gateways, but they can be problematic for a lot of people who are looking for sort of literal interpretations.
Those are gateways to moral relativism.
Yeah, exactly.
Secularism, and the damnation of all our teenagers. So, with that in mind,
praise the Lord. But maybe we should just. I don't know how long you want to go on this, but I think we sort of touched on the fact that one of the problems that people found with this film was the role that sexuality plays in it. There's definitely an eroticism to the film, I think is actually integral and vital to the story, because it's really wrestling through the core struggle. Jesus sometimes seems a little bit nuts at times, unhinged. But if you're dealing with a story that's exploring the complexity of this notion of human and divine, well, aren't you going to be a little torn apart by that? There's that scene where Jesus has the headache, Yeah. And it's funny because Scorsese seems to take these kind of big gospel things and actually make them quite small. Yeah. There's a dialing down. It's not like a Ten Commandments or King of Kings in terms of scope. It's very scratchy, in terms of location and stuff. And I think that's intentional by the author to sort of really consider the small way that these stories played out. We attribute these stories a grand scale, but if you think about it, in the ancient world, these were not stories that they weren't making it onto the news.
Yeah.
They were happening, in sort of desert locales far away from
backwater
stuff. And I appreciate that about the way that Scorsese tried to set that.
And it really didn't occur to me until today, you know, as we were kind of getting ready for this, that there's something about the use of sex and sexuality in this film that feels historically and maybe culturally challenging, because we live in a time now where it's just so taboo. And I don't really think it was that way in the first century, that if we could say it's far more liberal, or it was far more liberal.
Yeah, well,
and that's
I
not
just
even
think,
the right word, but just far more
I just think
open. And
it's just a different relationship towards human sexuality.
Yeah.
Human existence was a lot more primal, I think. You know, you're sort of you're scratching around, finding food to sustain life. You know, nobody's running to the taco stand, or there's no food trucks out there in the desert. You know what I mean? We're not talking Coachella here.
Yeah.
You know, we're you know, it's not a Coachella experience.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's why you have the story of the feeding of 5,000. If they had food trucks, it wouldn't have been a problem. You know? Dumb analogy, but
no.
But I think that there's a much more earthiness, and probably a disturbing kind of rawness.
And you have this run of
life.
Jesus movies that for most of film history portray that world completely opposite.
Yeah,
that it's like these drawing rooms, and you know.
Well, you know, in that regard, the cinema's not that different to the visual arts in the portrayal of Jesus. I mean, you walk into a museum where there's a huge amount of art, you know, religious art. And, you know, I mean, one of my favorite paintings is Gillian Dow's, the Road to Calvary, Christ on the Road to Calvary. And it's Jesus being led in a procession, and he's being followed by nuns, one of whom is holding Veronica's shroud. And there's like a guy in armor with like a 15th century rifle on his shoulder, you know. Yeah. And he's actually going to be crucified in the hills of Tuscany. It's really what's happening. You know what I mean? But
it's a beautiful place to go.
Yeah. You know, so in some ways we do quite often contextualize Jesus into our own world. So it's interesting that a filmmaker who's not trying to make a film that's true to the Gospels actually locates Jesus in an environment where it might actually be a richer portrayal of some of the reality of that situation.
I heard I listened to an interview with one of the producers of the movie about that, and the guy that, you know, is asking it all super film criticky about that kind of thing. He said, well, you know, originally we were going to make the movie and it got canceled, and when we got back, the budget was significantly smaller, so we had to make sure we shoot it on the cheap, which ended up leading to this much more I mean, these are the things that happen in films, and they seldom get talked about, but the budget of a film has a lot to do with how a film winds up looking.
Its theology might be bound to the budget more than it is the filmmaker's belief system.
Exactly. Yeah. And consequently, but we don't know that.
Right.
So we make these assessments, you know, aesthetic. We go, oh yeah, it's kind of lo-fi. That's so cool. And it's lo-fi because it had to be.
Money.
You know, there was no money. So, you know, we didn't have enough lights, and that gave it, you know, the accident of that made a beautiful thing happen, which could lead us to a theological podcast sometimes about imperfection and accidents. Tripp. Put that on the book. Put it on the books, mate.
Take a note.
All right, I'll write it down. But I came up with 5 topics you could discuss theologically about it. I thought I'd throw it out, and then y'all tell me how wrong or good they are.
All right, go.
It's because, but the first one is the relationship of religion and spirituality. But you need to read the opening.
I don't know if I have it all down here, but
you can read part of it.
I think it says the dual substance of Christ, the yearning so human, so superhuman of man to attain God has always been a deep, inscrutable mystery to me. My principal anguish and source of all my joys and sorrows from my youth onward has been the incessant, merciless battle between the spirit and the flesh, and my soul is the arena where these two armies have clashed and met.
And when you just pause and go,
drop the mic.
The name of the book.
I just dropped a pink pen.
And in the movie is Last Temptation.
Yeah.
I had never seen it, so when I'm watching it, I'm wondering, when are we going to get to the last temptation?
Yeah.
Everybody gets all up in arms for the last 5 minutes of the movie.
Yeah.
And when at the very end, after the cross, you have this angel come up to Jesus, have a very interesting conversation we can pick up in a minute, but you see, or Jesus gets the experience of living this whole life where his identity and vocation and endings weren't determined by this very serious unrest, right? Like you get to know Jesus' humanity, this unrest about his position, trying to like have pain, like deep spiritual and personal pain, and it drives him. He goes nuts repeatedly in the movie trying to figure out who God is. It's like, first I thought you wanted me to do the love thing and not do the axe at the ground like John the Baptist. Then you're like, no, let's axe it up.
Yeah.
And now you aren't even being clear with me, right? So what I find interesting is when you're thinking about the relationship of spirituality and religion, the way Jesus helps us frame it is the spiritual story is this anguish experience in it. The religious story we put on top of that anguish is God was born of a virgin, did these really sweet stuff, told some things, said love, and God raised him from the dead.
Yeah.
But what you see in the movie is the kind of hidden spiritual anxiety and torturement of
And I think that a part of that as well you could probably attribute to the fact that for the church, the divinity of Christ has been the real issue, and the support and affirmation of that has been central and integral. By the time you get to the 19th century, you start to get cracks in that armor through a whole host of things, whether it's Darwinian, or evolutionary theory, or whether it's Schweitzer and the historical Jesus and all those kind of things. But then what's really interesting to me, is the way in which the church itself, because, this is 1988. So this is like not 20 years after the Jesus movement. So that's another context to put this in, which in some ways was a
hippies for Jesus.
Well, it's kind of a recovery though of a humanity of Jesus within the horizon of the church that's not given real credence. So in some ways there's a contribution from Christianity itself by this embrace of a different vision of Jesus, a slightly more socially and culturally acceptable Jesus, that we'll get to when we talk about Godspell and stuff like that, that actually I think contributes to this conversation. But yeah, you're right, that spirituality in its raw form, religion in its proper form, come together in this film and in our comments about the film, I think.
In the movie, because it's been a few minutes since I've seen it, does Judaism play a role in terms of religiosity? Well, because most Jesus films don't.
See,
they just act like he's this non-affiliated person.
He's a nun.
Packing heat. Yeah.
I thought one of my favorite parts of it, prior to the end, which then distracts you from the first hour and 45 minutes, which I thought was pretty good for a Jesus movie, is the way you see Jesus's relationship to Rome and his relationship to Israel. So part of that spiritual torturing is from the very beginning, the presence of the cross and suffering as part of his vocation. Yeah. So it opens and Jesus is building crosses. Yeah. Judas, who you discover later is Judas, comes in and is like, you're a horrible Jew. You're building Roman crosses. Yeah. From the beginning, he says, this is a political and theological movie I'm about to tell you. You're building a cross. And it's connected to nightmares he has connected to the cross. Then in the middle of the transition in the first Act 2 is Jesus realizing he's going to the cross, right? And in it, that's where he pulls Judas aside after the second cleansing of the temple, and tells him his messianic mission is the cross, and interprets it with Isaiah 53. You're wounded for your transgression. Yeah. And he's explaining it to Judas. Judas is the one here, which in the other Gospels, Peter does it, and James and John, resisting Jesus's vocation as suffering servant. He's like, that's not what a Messiah does. It is this political thing. You're finally taking sides against this cross, and now you're telling, and now you're going to bear it.
Right.
Now, if you just pause there for a moment, that's like the most important question privileged people of the church should ask. Is Jesus's vocation, and hence ours, the church, to be cross builders, even if we don't technically put people on it? Or is it to be a cross bearer? And we should realize that for many ministers, many Christians, you're like taking Judas's side going, whoa, like, let's go get let's go attack the enemy. Let's put them on crosses. They were putting us on crosses. Or we have this victim complex as Christians, so now we have to be against culture. Or how are we going to fix the problem? Well, with our guns or with our concrete.
With the same tools.
And he's tortured by the tool of the power, and it's tortured in his spiritual identity, his religious identity as a Jew, and in the political tumult. And the other part about Judaism, his wrestling with it, is his explicit rejection of the law. And there is the crowd's totally into him at this point.
Yeah.
This is the first time in the temple making his speech, and he says, they're all happy. Then the priest comes out.
Yeah.
And the priest comes out, and you've had 2 long scenes in the movie where you don't see Jesus or Judas, and they are watching ritual killing, like straight up showing you bloody lambs collecting blood.
Yep.
And, the Jewish people in the singing with glee as they're killing these animals, and going along. Now, what does he do? Does he go, this Jewish act is really ugly, we're more evolved? No. He puts, not historically where it was, a statue of Caesar, in the middle of the courtyard of the Jewish people. That was not there while Jesus was there. We can go through the history later, but he puts it there because it was symbolically there.
Sure.
And there's blood coming down off the altar, and what's coming up behind the Caesar thing? Blood colored smoke.
Yep.
And from out of the smoke of Caesar comes the high priest and gives Jesus a one over. Like, what are you doing? And he's like, don't you know the law? They can't pay with these coins that have Caesar's name on here, calling him God. They have to exchange it, Jesus. Do you want them all to break Torah while I'm holding this and demonstrating my connection to Caesar and Rome and the power the cross builders have? And Jesus says, I'm throwing away the law. God, and he said, does God change God's mind is the question.
Yeah.
Yes. He said, I'm throwing away the law. God has not changed, or God hasn't changed, but decided that our hearts can hold more. God is not an Israelite.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the point in that one scene where the crowd turns against him.
Yeah.
Which is connected to Luke 4, or anytime Jesus, so he's saying, here's the purpose of the religion. It's spiritual.
Yeah.
You're making it religious, but to be a good the spirituality of Judaism, then it's not making God an Israelite.
Yeah.
Or subservient to Rome.
Yeah, profound.
This is I'm glad you bring that up, because even though Judas, I mean, he's more of a present character in this film than he is most Jesus films. But you could do a film series of Jesus movies where you just analyze that relationship between Jesus and Judas, and it's always political. And it's telling about, if it's in the 50s, it's telling because it's usually about something going on in the world and not necessarily about what you just articulated. But I think that's a powerful, kind of a gateway into the film to think about it.
So that's one theme.
Well, I mean, it was two.
Yes,
one is the power.
Yeah. Number 2.
Yeah. Well, the other part is the political power side of it. The other theme that comes up and is connected to is, what is the weight of the cross? Is it the actual experience of Jesus suffering on the cross? Is it that he carried the cross and knew that was his destiny? Is it what the cross symbolizes about the status of Israel, their subjugation? And is the cross in the text is it the cross, or is the cross just the expression of his tortured life. Because twice in the film, Jesus has a stigmata.
Yeah.
And I thought, I mean, I had never seen it before, so I'm just like, oh, Chuck, I'd not thought of that, because I'm not Eastern Orthodox writing mystical whatnot movies to then have Scorsese mess with them. But he has this stigmata, and it's the stigmata experience that leads to him telling Judas, right, what's going to happen. And he's like, you're going to have to turn me in, Judas. You promised, Judas, if I wasn't a member of the revolution against Rome, I would be killed. Why? Judas had promised to kill him because he built crosses. Yeah. He's like, the moment you are not against the cross, I'm going to kill you. Yeah. What a wonderful dualism. Yeah. And Jesus looks at him and says, I have you here for this very purpose. Yeah. You're the only one who will pull through and literally get me killed because you already promised and you're not against your word. The others love me too much and they won't let me do what I need to do. So he leaves and he's like, to go, set up Jesus. And, he's like, but what about the others? And then he says, I will tell them at night. And that's when he does the, Last Supper. And in it, it's all the fleshly reading. Yeah. And then you see in their mouth, the wine and bread literally become flesh and blood.
I mean, I think it's profound on those levels.
But if you take those and set it right next to the question around spirituality and stuff, one of the brilliant things about the movie is it insists that spirituality is fully embodied in material. Yeah. It is about Jesus's literal blood. It's about the gospel goal here can't happen without someone being faithful to their word and friendship, even though it rends them asunder. Yeah. Like Jesus-Judas friendship that comes is the most human element in it.
Well, and on one level, you could argue that that's one of the missed opportunities in most theological discourse or church discourse is the dynamic of that relationship. He's not, it's almost like he's the Judas is viewed as, he's like the patsy he's like the chess piece that's brought in to make the whole thing work. But the intimacy of the relationship between Jesus and Judas, I think, is one of the things that the film really successfally.
Jesus is trying to get himself killed. Yeah. He's like, can you please hurry up, God? I don't want to wuss out.
Yeah. There's a, Barry, I don't know if you saw this, but there was a documentary that I think ran on BBC or maybe Channel 4, I can't remember, called Sorry, Judas.
No, I didn't.
And it's about the representation of Judas in history and art and film. Yeah. And it is fascinating because it basically creates the conversation that doesn't exist.
One of my favorite books of poetry is by Brendan Kennelly. It's called The Book of Judas. Mm-hmm. I think it's like a 400-page word poem about Judas. Worth a read if you can find it.
What's the literature professor at Duke that did a collection of short stories, and two of them are Judas related? Reynolds.
Oh, yeah.
Price? Reynolds Price?
Yeah, Reynolds Price.
Oh, yeah. Great. It does, he does these like stories to help explain, add on, and Judas becomes,
and
a more conflicted
Ray Anderson, Fuller did a book on, the gospel according to Judas. I mean,
and
but in general, it's an undermined thing. But coming back to your comment too about the weight of the cross, I mean, I think that's again another really good question, because I think you could argue, and maybe that's what you were saying, that the film itself is an exploration of the weight of that. The story itself is the weight of the cross. That's what the weight of the cross is. It's not what you carry on your back. It's what you carry in all of your life as you move towards that experience.
And you see the crescendo moment where he's going to the cross comes right after they put the crown of thorns, which the one in this movie is ginormous. Yeah. And he comes out.
You're gonna build a crown of thorns.
Well, that's the one place they showed Mel Gibson what's up. I mean, they don't beat it into his head like Mel does. Yeah. Each drop is a soul saved for heaven. He comes out with his with his crown of thorns on, and he's standing almost naked with the crown of thorns, having been whipped under the statue of Caesar with the smoke.
Symbolism is pretty profound. But again, I would argue that that's attention to detail is part of Scorsese's obsession in cinema. That's why his films are always so long.
Yeah.
But, you know, what's the movie with about New York? Not the Gangs of New York, but the one
New York.
No, is that the one with like Michelle Pfeiffer and Daniel Day-Lewis? You know, where it's like just those scenes over the like dinner table.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Overlooked film, but anyway, you know, that obsessive symbolic attention to detail that it's the small things that
he has. All of the Romans have British accents.
Yeah.
And
well, you know,
that's a historically.
Yeah, which again,
prevalent.
I think was in, we're not really going to talk about this movie, but Last Days in the Desert, I like the fact that Ewan McGregor actually plays a Scottish Jesus. I thought that was like, you know, and, Kieran Hines is Irish, you know, I mean, that's always the trouble is what, you know, what do you go for in terms of authenticity?
Well, I think it uses it because it's like Rome, the empire, and then
the Brits are always the villains. I mean, there's it's just another thing.
Well, you know, we're so polite, but underneath we're really seething.
Yeah, it's another thing that, to your point about the budget, right? Like what we don't know. You know, this other film, Jesus film recently, we're not going to talk about it, but the Young Messiah, which is based on the Anne Rice novel, out of Christ the Lord, where it's a child Jesus, you know, and you talk to the producers, and the child Jesus is this wonderfully good-looking kid with a thick British accent, and you think, you know, why do you make that choice? You know, and really, their argument was we picked our Jesus. We found this dynamic kid, and then we had to build the film around him. Yeah. Right? So we couldn't have this British-speaking Jesus with a Mary and Joseph sounding like they're from the Middle East. Right. You know?
Well, one of the fascinating parts about the choice, for whatever reason, is the first time you get a long British talk is the pilot conversation. And
you're going to blame us now?
No. It is also obvious. Pilot does have the most refined British accent of the ones. But he, was it Bowie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then you're going to say something about this. I found
the man who sold the world. But, boom.
So he sits there, and Pilate in his discussion, it's like subtly Pilate's like, well, you know what I'm going to have to do. And he's not losing any sweat over this. No. But he's fascinated by it. Yeah. So what is it that Pilate's fascinated by? Is the actual, he's someone who first sees what Jesus is doing and why it's threatening. Yeah. And why it's more of a threat than violent overthrow. And Pilate says, I don't care if it's changed through love or changed through killing. We can't allow change either way. You should have counted the skulls at Golgotha. Yeah. So he's saying the world is going to stay as it is. You should have counted the skulls, and your way of love is significantly more threatening than a bunch of zealots. We know what to do with those. Yep. And so what did you make of that as that is right before you do the crown, walk out. That's the turning point before you get the other movie in a movie.
Well, again,
the short film.
I mean, again, I think we're going back to the desire of the storytellers, both in the novel and in the film, to grapple with both the life that Jesus lives, the complexity of this torn life, you know, torn by dual aims, perhaps, or dual desires, or whatever, and the context in which that life is lived out, and it raises questions that are historically repetitive and a reminder, really, that there are gatekeepers who resist change, positive or negative, because they have an investment in the status quo. And I think you could boomerang that back and go, that's one of the reasons why there's such antagonism sometimes within the horizon of religion when a film comes along that actually portrays something that's radically true in the story that they're defending, because it heralds their own demise. And when David Bowie says it, it's just doubly authoritative. Let's just face it.
Yes.
I mean, if you're going to pick somebody to play Pilate in your movie and have the seminal scene and go, count the skulls, might as well be Bowie.
I know. I thought to myself, Barry, what a better thing than David Bowie asking you to count the skulls on Golgotha, which is a real reference, like to count the cost of carrying the cross and this kind of thing.
Again, yeah.
So when you get to the cross in the movie, and I'm thinking the movie's almost done, and then I realize it's not.
Silly you.
And you get a
strap it in. We got a long way to go.
You get a normal cross scene.
Yeah.
And it's, and the words on the cross are the forgive them.
Yep.
Like, Father, forgive them. You get a storm, then this calm comes, and you can't see or hear any of the stuff that's going on. Guardian angel comes up. Now, I have to say, the whole time I was trying to decide whether it was Satan or a guardian angel, and I don't know which way it was supposed to be, because by the end,
do we even care?
You're like, oh, this is interesting. So, little guardian angel figure, it's like, says something interesting. God doesn't need your blood.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Jesus' own understanding of God went back and forth on this throughout the book. Yeah. I mean, the movie. Yeah. Then the angel said, God doesn't need your blood, and God loves you, so just come on down. He ends up marrying Mary Magdalene. He looks at the world, and all of a sudden it's green, and she's like, this is what the world looks like if you're spiritually centered.
Yeah.
They have kids. Then God kills Mary Magdalene, which he gets pissed at God about, obviously.
Yeah.
The angel doesn't go, life's arbitrary, God isn't. She's like, no, God killed him.
Yeah.
Or kills her, but don't complain about it, and gives us really excellent advice. There's only one woman in the world. They just have different faces. So then he remarries. Then he bangs his next wife's cousin or whoever else that lives near them. Has kids. Mm-hmm. Does his carpentry, not making stuff. What in the world? I was enjoying the movie, and then you get this.
Why did you not like that last temptation?
That's what I'm asking. I'm
fascinated that that's the last temptation.
Yes.
Right? That there's not, that it is sex, that it is
get married.
Yeah. that is.
Well, don't you think that maybe what's coming up there, because and I mentioned this a little bit, is there seems to be, particularly with John the Baptist and stuff, a sort of eroticizing of the characters. And there's the comments, I think, that Scorsese even made, that there's a link between deep spiritual experience and the sexual. Mm-hmm. That maybe what that heralds is just a deeper dive into the power of the erotic and the sexual, and that's where the real temptation lies. Which way do you go? Do you go with the sexual? Do you go with the sexio spiritual, or do you go with the cross spirit? The theo spiritual. I don't know, but it seems to me that within the horizon of the story, that move towards the experience of the sexual encounter of marriage. I mean, it's interesting, marriage as well. So, but family. So you move into that world that perhaps it's just raising up the question of the fine line between the sexual, the erotic and the spiritual, and how that can play, the permutations that heralds.
There's no real sense in the movie, if I remember, of there being any sort of impending punishment should he have followed that last temptation.
No.
That it's not like this is a bad or lesser thing to do.
It's just a thing.
Yeah. And it's the choice that the films Jesus makes to stay on the cross.
Yeah. Well, and again, maybe that's
I see one of the ways, and I didn't know, this is at least one of the things that went through my head was by the time you get Jesus old and crotchety with kids, and encountering Paul, which is just a very fascinating scene. He overhears Paul preaching about him and gets kind of frustrated.
Yeah.
And goes to set him straight.
As you might.
And Paul pulls him aside, like, look. Here are the things that Paul mentions the virgin conception, of Mary which Paul does not mention in anywhere in Acts or anything he wrote. So Paul became the voice of the tradition, right? Yeah. And then says, look, I don't care if you got down off the cross or doing all good, have your kids. The only hope is the resurrected Christ. I don't care what happened. I created the truth out of what people believe and what they need.
Yeah.
And
there you have the cultural critic, the cultural, Scorsese, the cultural critic who challenges institutional religion for its bastardizing of a story, right? To serve its own particular end. I mean, that's where you get the real challenge when you see a film like this, where Scorsese's anti-institutional bias, I think, comes to the fore, and then you're faced with looking at another, and unfortunately, it's not enough. I mean, to some degree, the Paul character is just a foil for that particular moment, but it's an interesting moment
He's the only one that sounds like a Southerner in the movie.
Yeah. So, I'm the only one that doesn't sound like a Southerner in this podcast.
Well,
just wanted to point that out.
So,
who was Paul?
I don't know who played him, but I
can't remember.
He was a Southerner, and when you get the transition out of it, you have this life or this temptation. If you take the experience of the entire Last Temptation back to some of the questions, I think you end up valuing there's a new valuing to his entire life experience up to that point.
Yeah.
Look at how mundane, spiritual-less, and lifeless he was when he had this thing that he thought, it's being kept from me. But then he has it, and it gets taken away. Look what happens when someone doesn't stay faithful to a gospel of love instead of one of power. Then you end up with a God who arbitrarily kills the person you love. It's like every woman's the same, just, it's just a bunch of faces. Like there's an interesting connection between his own experience and then the theological conclusions that come out of it that get explored in the temptation. Cause I saw it and said, well, when you look at it, if you take the, God being revealed in Jesus off the table, what can you say about God about these type of things? And it's around power.
Yeah.
Wrath, blood, suffering, the seeming, domination system after domination system in history. Like, Jesus's own personal story also, I think, serves as a challenge to the church to reflect, like, if your understanding of Christ doesn't go all the way through the cross, then it lapses back into an ideology of empire, of religion without spirituality, and this type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So, we probably don't want to talk about the score by Peter Gabriel, do we?
I did hear in one of
That's all you.
You should say something about it.
It's just the Peter Gabriel did the score for the movie, and I think it's perhaps the most forward sounding movie score of that era on some levels, just in terms of the way it kind of attempts to capture the starkness of the tale. It's a pretty stark, somewhat harsh soundtrack. I don't need to say a whole lot about it, but
I know that,
but it does add to the story. It's one of the components of looking at a film is music plays a role. It's a storytelling component in any film.
There's a number of scenes where the song will have been playing for a while.
Yeah.
And then you discover, because the camera moves to a different location, that the people in this location were the ones singing. So there's a couple songs that are going. No
Which
one
is an
part
interesting
of it.
way of marrying the score to the film itself. But
I thought it was interesting.
You know, the tension in the music is I think really a good solid underscore of the tension in the story. Hey Ryan, if you were gonna like pair this with a film, like with another Jesus film, what do you think would be a good one to pair it with? Something that came before, perhaps.
And it's not something that we necessarily talk about in this series.
Like, would you stick it with King of Kings?
I would, yeah.
That would be an interesting pairing.
Because DeMille, I mean, you know, what's fascinating is that all of these highly celebrated religious films, I would put King of Kings in that list, but you could also add the Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur, movies like this. Maybe not Ben-Hur, but I mean,
The Robe.
The Robe. Yeah. And King of Kings starts with this love triangle, right? Between Mary
That's what I was
Magdalene,
thinking.
Judas, and Jesus.
That might be an interesting, if you were going to do this as a like little group.
And it's very sensual
thing.
at the beginning.
Yeah, it might be worth sort of screening King of Kings and following it up with The Last Temptation, and then looking at the gap between those two films.
And then the ways they're doing similar things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look at the service.
That's bonus.
Look at the
bonus
service.
content for your listeners.
Bonus. Speaking of Bo knows things.
Bono.
Yeah.
Bono is the musical Jesus. Bo Jackson is the football Jesus.
I thought that was Tim Tebow.
Tim Tebow is almost as good at quarterback.
Do you think you could get him on the podcast? See what his favorite Jesus movie is?
Tim Tebow.
Let's take a guess at what his favorite Jesus movie is.
Tim Tebow is a quality NFL quarterback in a very. It's like calling the Passion of the Christ an excellent.
Fortunately,
Yes.
I know nothing about American football, so I feel
Tim Tebow,
evangelical, highly evangelical.
People like kept pulling for him, buy his clothes, like get him on teams and stuff, and he's not actually that good in the NFL. He was great in college.
Yeah.
He just can't throw.
He peaked early.
But he was also, just, he was this champion, right? He was like this, he said he was a virgin, right? Like he has this girlfriend.
Oh.
All these like super conservative values he's
The Last Temptation of Tim Tebow?
Yeah.
Yes.
Tim Tebow
that was
would have
probably
been,
a Sports Illustrated article somewhere along the way.
See, from what I've heard about traveling as an NFL star, you were actually in similar experiences to Jesus, who is just in the next room, half watching Mary Magdalene.
I hate to bring this up, lads, but we may have gone off on a tangent.
You think this is how you land a plane?
All right.
Let's just jump out.